In the last section, we spoke about the purpose of the it function. So we've now provided it a description right here, and then in the body of this function, we're going to write out the actual test logic that proves that our app component shows a comment box. So to write the actual test logic inside of here, we're going to write out some code that looks very similar, almost identical. Well, actually it is identical to some of the code that we saw earlier when we first generated our project. So we're just going to write that code out, and then we'll talk about exactly what it's doing. So inside of the it function, I'll write out const div equals document dot create div. Then underneath that, we'll write out React DOM dot render. I'll pass in an instance of our app component, like so. And then as a second argument, I'll pass in the div. And then finally on the third line down here, I'll say React DOM dot unmount component at node, and I'll pass in the same div, like so. Okay, so 3 lines of code. At present, these 3 lines of code will somewhat test our component, but they don't actually kind of really say that the component is doing any distinct behavior. All that's happening right now is we're going to try to render our app component, and that's pretty much it. Nothing else really happens. And so if we ran this test as it stands right now, this test would really just prove that our app component does not crash or does not throw an error when we try to render it. Now that's definitely useful, but it doesn't really meet the goal of the test, which is to somehow prove that the app component shows a comment box inside of it. Now before we move forward and modify this code at all, let's dive in to these 3 lines right here and get a better idea of what's going on. All right, so I'm going to pull up a diagram. Here we go. Okay, so as we've said several times now, anytime you and I run our tests, we're going to flip on over to our command line and execute the npm run test command. When we run that command, it starts up Jest, which is our automated test runner. So the important thing here to understand is that when we run Jest, it's being executed inside of our command line environment. It's being ran from the terminal. The issue with that is that when we try to run React in any way, shape, or form, React always expects that it's being executed inside the browser. The React library itself only functions correctly if it's being executed inside the browser. And so you can kind of very quickly realize that the browser and the command line environment are not the same thing. But we want to somehow run our React code nonetheless. So to solve this issue, to solve the fact that React expects to be executed inside the browser, but we are running Jest from the command line, Create React App automatically installed a dependency into our project when we first generated it. That dependency is called JSDOM. The JSDOM library is kind of a code implementation or a JavaScript code implementation of how the browser works. So you can kind of imagine that JSDOM right here kind of fakes out the existence of the browser and fools or tricks the React library into thinking that there is in fact a browser that React is working with. So when you and I, right here on this line of code or this little segment of code right here, start making reference to something called document, or when we try to create a div element, we're not actually creating a div inside of a browser. There's no div inside of a browser. There's no Chrome here. There's no Firefox, no Internet Explorer. Instead, when this code is executed from our terminal, we make use automatically of the JSDOM library to create a fake div. So this div right here, not a real div. It's a fake div that exists solely inside of memory inside the terminal, and it does not exist inside of any browser. But that's good enough to fool out React and make it think that it's actually working directly inside of a browser. So that kind of gives you a better idea of what's going on behind the scenes here when we start calling things like document. Remember, document is traditionally an object that exists solely inside the browser. This document object right here is automatically furnished for us by JSDOM. That's where it's coming from. So now that you have that in mind, I want to give you a second diagram that's going to give you a better idea of what's going on with the overall snippet right here. Okay, so here's pretty much what's going on. With that little chunk of code, we are telling JSDOM, the library JSDOM, to create a new div element. So this is an element that exists solely in memory and is not tied to any browser instance or anything like that. We then attempt to take our app component instance and render it into this div right here, this kind of div that's floating in space solely inside of our terminal. So behind the scenes, React is going to take our app component, it's going to take the HTML that is produced by that component, it's going to take that HTML and stick it into that div element. So after this line of code right here, where we go through that process, right down here, like right here or so, we then have the ability to write out some additional amount of code that inspects that div element and figure out exactly what's going on inside of it. So right here, you and I could possibly write out some code that maybe looks inside the div and checks to see if the comment box is in there. So that div is going to contain all the HTML that was produced by the app component. And so in theory, hopefully that's going to contain the HTML that belongs to the comment box as well. So that's why right here is a perfect place to write one more line of code that's going to look inside that div and check to see if the comment box actually exists. So we'll write out that code in just a moment, but before we do, I want to mention the last line of code right here. So on this line of code, I bet you can read this function name and get a good idea of what's going on. This function is going to look at the div, it's going to find the app component that we just rendered into it, and it's going to remove that app component entirely. So this right here is a step that we refer to as cleanup after our tests run. You see, anytime we start running tests, anytime we start running dozens or hundreds or even thousands of tests, we start getting a little bit concerned about the performance of our tests. So many times after running some testing code, we'll do a little bit of cleanup, or we'll kind of destroy any leftover objects or unmount any components that we had created during the test. And that's exactly what's happening right here. If we do not call this function right here and attempt to clean up the div or the component inside that div, then the component will just sit around forever as long as our test suite is running. And over time, that's going to take up some amount of memory, and it's going to cause our entire test suite to run more and more slowly, which is obviously not ideal. Throughout this course, I'm going to make sure I pay special attention and tell you directly, like very clearly, whenever we are writing some cleanup code so that you start to develop a sense of when we need to clean something up and when we can kind of just throw it away and not worry about it. Okay, so now that we've kind of pulled this chunk of code right here apart in great detail, let's take a quick pause, and when we come back to the next section, we will start to add another line of code that's going to look inside that div and see if the comment box is there. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.